Welcome everyone to the FCCJ. My name is Bobby van der List. I'll be today's moderator. Before we start this press conference, I'd like to ask everyone to switch off your phone or put them on silent mode, please.
Good idea.
If you will. Yes, today's speaker, we're honored to be joined by the EU ambassador to Japan, Ms. Patricia Flor, who was officially inaugurated in November last year, if that's correct?
September.
September,
Oh,
sorry.
Oh, you are right, because I handed over my credentials in November.
Okay, stick with November.
Yes.
And yeah, on December 1st, a new European Commission started under leadership of Germany's Ursula von der Leyen. And we have the privilege, to be joined by Ms. Flor, who will talk a little bit more about the priorities of this new Commission. One important aspect is, of course, the trade deal between Japan and the EU that went into effect last February, and which represents 30% of global GDP and 40% of worldwide trade, and impacts 600 million people, which makes it the biggest free trade agreement in the world. But at the same time, the EU and Japan face challenges and uncertainty. For example, Britain's future ahead of a snap election, which is dominated by Brexit. Well, a little bit more about the background of today's speaker, which is quite impressive. As some of you might not know, she started as a journalist.
Yes, it's true.
Very briefly, in the 1980s, you worked for the Nürnberger Nachrichten,
Yes,
if I pronounce that correctly.
absolutely.
And soon she realized she wanted to work in diplomacy. Her CV is impressive. Ms. Flor, she was EU's special representative for Central Asia, Germany's ambassador for Georgia, and political and press officer at the German embassy in Kazakhstan. She managed to become fluent in English, Russian, and French, and has a good understanding of Georgian. So we're curious to know how your Japanese is after 1 year. We'll start with a short presentation, then we'll move to a Q&A session. So I would like to give the floor to Ms. Flor.
Thank you, konnichiwa. I think, unfortunately, on the Japanese side, ima wa benkyu shite imasu. Demo taihen desu ne. So, yes, I'm doing my best, but still a lot to do. So I go immediately into my presentation, which indeed is related to the fact that we have a new leadership in Brussels, a new commission under the lead of Ursula von der Leyen, the new president of the commission, and of course also Monsieur Michel, who is the president of the European Council. Now, let me outline, first of all, the key priorities and some facts about this new commission and leadership in Brussels. First, I would like to point out that this is the commission which is closest ever to gender parity. So we have, in terms of gender balance, 12 women and 15 men in this new commission in Brussels. And let me also say that the commission for the first time will have something which is called EXCO, an External Coordination Committee, because in today's world, everything we do in terms of internal policies is very closely intertwined with everything that goes on externally in the world. So this is also a new intervention acknowledging that we have to bridge our domestic policies and to actually make them fit well with our external policies. Important also for Japan-EU relations. The president of the new commission, Ursula von der Leyen, she outlined 6 key priorities, and I will name them now. It's not that these priorities have never been there in the past, so it's also, of course, continuity in terms of EU policies, but the emphasis will now be on these 6 priorities. The first one is a European Green Deal. So that means the EU recognizes the threats inherent in climate change and environmental pollution, and therefore the EU, under the lead of Ursula von der Leyen, wants to be the world's first climate-neutral continent. So the proposal from the Commission is that Europe should be carbon neutral by 2050. But of course, the idea is also that while cutting emissions, we create at the same time jobs and we maintain growth. And I can go more into that if you are interested. The second priority is an economy that works for people. What is that about? This is about actually being competitive, so having an economy which can also in the digital age, in the new era of globalization, do well, but at the same time an economy that ensures social fairness and takes into account the needs of all of our citizens in the EU. Third priority, a Europe fit for the digital age. And behind this goal is not only that the EU should actually master and also have ownership of key technologies for the future, but it also means that the EU wants to empower people so that they can make full and best use of all of these new technologies. The fourth priority is promoting our European way of life. And there are certain values and interests and objectives which have always underpinned the European project. And among them is equality and human rights and equal opportunities. And therefore, the vision is to build a union of equality where everyone, regardless of their gender, of their background, their social background, of their race, where all of them have the same access to opportunities and can benefit from Europe. Fifth priority, a stronger Europe in the world. The EU wants to aim at playing a greater role on the world stage. So the EU accepts that it has to be a responsible global leader. It is a challenge, but it's one which we embrace. And from my point of view, the EU also has a unique policy toolbox because we know that you need cooperative multilateral solutions. Otherwise, the EU couldn't survive at all. So therefore, multilateral cooperation is in our DNA. And that's also what we think is necessary to emphasize in today's global environment. Sixth priority, a new push for European democracy. That is about strengthening also democracy within the Union. That includes the role, of course, of the European Parliament, but also participation by citizens and by civil society. If you take a look at these 6 priorities, you will see that the first, the third, and the fifth, meaning the European Green Deal, the digital aspect, and Europe's role in the world, of course, have also a direct impact on our relationship with Japan. And so let me now go into the second part of my presentation, which is really about EU-Japan relations as we see them today. First of all, Japan is a natural partner for the EU because we are major trading partners. We have already pointed out that we are about 30%, a little bit less of global GDP. We also are democracies, and we do share common values and interests. And we also believe in a rules-based international system, which we know we have to defend together. And this is especially also necessary when we confront global cross-border challenges, climate change, sustainable development, terrorism, so you can go down a very long list. In this regard, if I look at EU-Japan, 2019 has been a landmark year and a very successful year because we saw the entry into force of the Economic Partnership Agreement, cementing our economic relationship. And of course, we also saw the provisional application of the Strategic Partnership Agreement, which is also very important from my point of view because it's the first ever, broad foreign policy agreement that the EU has done in this regard. And let me quote here your Prime Minister Abe, who said about the role of these agreements. He said, "If the world were a ship sailing the open seas, these two agreements would serve as a stabilizer to counteract even the most severe pitching and rolling." So you can see the idea is if we bring our forces together, we will be better placed to weather the uncertainties of this world. And let me add to this a quote from Ursula von der Leyen, the new Commission President, at the European Parliament last week. She said, "The world needs our leadership more than ever to keep engaging with the world as a responsible power, to be a force for peace and for positive change." And she went on to say, "We must show our partners that they can rely on us as a champion of multilateralism." And of course, in this endeavor, Japan is foremost also in our minds. You could also see that in our engagement with Japan in terms of G20. Japan had the G20 presidency for this year, and we worked very closely with Japan in order to ensure that we could get a good communique from the G20 Osaka summit. But we've already this year then expanded this partnership even further. So President Juncker, the former president of the Commission, and Prime Minister Abe signed the new Partnership on Sustainable Connectivity and Quality Infrastructure. And again, it's the first ever signature and the first ever such document for the EU. Now, let's look at some of these areas. First, the economic cooperation, and here I will say a few words more about the EPA. As it was already pointed out, the impact of this economic partnership is huge because EU and Japan represent such a huge chunk of the global economy. And it is, again, the world's biggest trade agreement as of now. The key is that this agreement will create jobs and it will assist economic growth. So we are looking for employment opportunities for people both in Japan and in the EU. And let me also say that this agreement was negotiated and conceived in a way which ensures that there is mutual benefit, that both sides benefit fairly from this trade agreement with our different priorities, but that at the end of the day, our businesses, consumers, and then thus economies and societies can reap the benefits of this agreement. And let me say that right now we have less than a year since the entry into force of the EPA. But we know from statistics done by the Japanese authorities that the agreement is the most popular and used in Japan among all of the free trade agreements that Japan has. And let me say that also if I look at the monthly trade figures, that we can clearly see that we have a significant increase in trade between Japan and the EU. And let me also add that this is really remarkable because, as you are aware, the global economy is currently on a downturn. So we see that in many other areas we have actually a decrease in numbers. The EPA is also not only about tariffs and trade, but it is about intensified economic cooperation in the larger sense beyond goods, services, public procurement, but also cooperation on standards and on regulations. And that is very important because for the future, one of the questions is, can EU and Japan be standard setters, especially in areas of new technologies, together? So if we can agree on certain rules, how to deal with automated driving or with drones or with artificial intelligence, could then that be a model also for others to follow? And that, of course, will be essential for our future success. So overall, the EPA is not only about our bilateral relationship, but in this context of protectionism and difficulties also regarding the World Trade Organization, it is also about demonstrating to the world that if you bank on free and fair trade and a level playing field, you can do well, and you can do business, and therefore you can be successful. Second area that I want to say a few words about is obviously the strategic partnership agreement. And that is very important because it opens space for increasing our cooperation really across the board. If you read it, you will find that nearly all policy areas you can think about are actually in the agreement. Now, that means that it gives us a legal basis for engaging on security issues, on climate, on environment, on the oceans, so on basically everything. But of course, we can't do that all at the same time. So therefore, in our discussions with Japan, we have now identified 3 key priority areas which we want to engage on first. One is connectivity. I've mentioned the agreement signed in Brussels in September. And that the idea behind that is that we know that we need to make this world even better connected in terms of transportation and infrastructure, in terms of energy grids, but also in terms of people-to-people exchanges and digital networks. So we are looking for finding synergies between Japan and the EU in all of these areas. Of course, what we also agree on in this partnership is that we base this on joint standards. So we want sustainable connectivity, including that sustainability. We want transparency and open tenders, so a level playing field for all of our businesses in this regard. And let me give you here already one example, because there are already now European and Japanese companies engaging together. One example is a waste heat recovery plant actually being built in Malaysia with technologies and in a cooperation mode between a European, in this case a German, and a Japanese company. Second big priority is security. If we don't have security, if we don't have stability, then of course all of our own efforts are put into question. So therefore, to give you a few examples, Japan and the EU cooperate very closely on challenges such as North Korea or Iran, so coming from the proliferation field. So we both agree that North Korea needs to do complete and verifiable and irreversible denuclearization. We agree on fully implementing the sanctions. And on Iran, let me say that while the EU does everything we can to uphold the nuclear agreement with Iran, even now when it's becoming extremely difficult. So therefore, Japan's support in this regard, including the visit by Prime Minister Abe to Tehran, is highly appreciated. So there are other fields where I think we can engage together also in the security area. I give you one concrete example. On 22 November in Tokyo, we had an event with the previous High Representative Mogherini and your Minister of Defense, Kono-san, and they together spoke on the role of women in peace and security. Again, this is the linkage between our gender equality diversity goals and the peace and security field, where the participation of women can be essential. Now, third area, and then I will end, digital policy and cybersecurity. This is important both bilaterally but then also globally and in the G20 process. Bilaterally, Japan and the EU agreed on mutual data adequacy. Very technical term, I know. What does it mean? It means that we agree that in our two systems, the way of data management and the data protection rules are adequate. So that means that we can allow the free flow of data between the European Union and Japan without any restrictions. It's very important because it creates the first and I think the biggest space for a protected and safe free flow of data between our economies. Now, for the EU, these two elements are essential, and also for Japan. So Prime Minister Abe's initiative, data free flow with trust, has the same idea. In order to be successful in the digital age, we need data to be able to be to flow freely across borders and to be shared between companies and institutions. But at the same time, we need that our privacy is protected, that intellectual property is protected, that we all understand what happens with these data, and so therefore we have to combine the high level of protection with the free flow. And therefore the EU also in the G20 context supported the Japanese approach on this. We also cooperate with Japan in the research and technology areas which are related to digital, smart cities, Internet of Things, and so forth. So there's a lot that we can do together also between our universities and research institutions. The last important element also in this field of both digital but then also the field of connectivity is that somehow we need to find the resources to finance these joint activities, and therefore let me mention here that the European Investment Bank signed a number of MOUs, memorandums of understanding, so with JICA, the Japanese agency here, but also with JBIC and NEXI, Japanese Bank for International Cooperation, and the Export and Investment Insurance, in order to be able to leverage joint funding for our endeavors in this regard. So I'll close here, and let me just say that from my personal experience, having arrived last year, I can see that we have a very dynamic development of this partnership. So we both realize we are destined in a way to be strategic partners, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to be able to contribute to building this close partnership with Japan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for an interesting presentation and a very ambitious goals for the future, but it's like you said, it's a very exciting time to be in Japan. We will now move to the Q&A session, starting with the working press. And before asking a question, please state your name and affiliation. Are there any questions from the audience?
I've talked too much, I see. No questions.
Or you answered all questions they might have had. Yeah. Yeah, please walk up to the microphone.
Thank you for taking it. My name is Satoru Koda with Gdpr, and I'd like to ask the trilateral relation Japan and EU and the United States. So recently, Japan concluded the domestic process regarding Japan and the United States trade agreement, and it will be going to the effect next coming months. So how do you evaluate this movement, and could you please tell me that current situation and focus regarding the EU and the United States trade negotiation? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And first of all, let me say that if you look at it in the trilateral format, then I would want to mention that we actually have a very regular and intensive trilateral cooperation, EU, Japan, and United States, on, for instance, WTO reform. So, and on other, global trade issues. So we also discuss all of these issues in a trilateral format and try to promote WTO reform, which was also a promise that came out of the G20 summit in Osaka, because everybody realizes we need to reform the International Trade Organization, the World Trade Organization. Now, on the US-Japan agreement, which was just ratified by the Diet, the EU always analyzes very carefully all trade agreements which are made between or among key trading partners of the EU, because it's important to us. If you have experience with trade negotiations, you will know that trade agreements are very complex and extremely detailed. So therefore, currently the analysis is ongoing in Brussels, in DG Trade, and we will see what the final result is. Let me say that, of course, what are we usually looking at? We always look at, is there an impact, or what does it mean for our own interests as EU? And then, of course, we also look at how does it fit with WTO rules. The latter is very important to us also because if we want a global, fair, system, and therefore that of course means that all trade agreements should be in line with the WTO standards and rules. Now, let me say that I'm of course also aware that the US and Japan have already announced that they will enter into a next round of negotiations. So of course that also will then need to be factored in at some stage into this analysis. At the same time, the EU and the US have, of course, also started discussing their bilateral trade relationship. And let me say here that the European Commission, still the old one, was given a mandate by member states what these negotiations should cover. And since then, we are willing and ready to engage also with the US in detail. So far, there hasn't been really a lot of negotiations happening, so this is something that we will certainly be looking at in 2020.
Are there any more questions? Well, then I'll just take... please, go ahead.
Associates?
Yeah. I'll open the floor to associate members as well.
Thank you. name is Kurt Sieber, associate member, and I would like to thank the ambassador for a very, very extensive preparation and presentation. And I myself was, for 4 years, I was on the board of governors of the Austrian business, not only the Austrian but also the European Business Council. Now, in the 3 chapters about collaboration, specific priority for Japan, I'm missing the green part. I think Japan may need some support from the EU, as according to yesterday's newspaper, Japan made, together with Brazil and Australia, the fossil of the day for coal use, yes, and particularly also for promoting and financing coal-fired electricity production abroad. What is your idea or your comment on this subject? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Indeed, let me start by saying that, as I've said, for the EU, the European Green Deal is essential. That's, of course, first of all, also about bringing the EU to fully implement Paris. And let me say that we are fully on track with regard to that. And the current discussion in Brussels is really about how can we be even more ambitious. Because if you look at the scientific evidence and if you look at the recent reports coming from the International Climate Panel, then it is very clear that we all must do more. And if I say we all, then I really think all of the countries of the world need to do more in order to really meet the goal that was in the Paris Agreement. It is in the Paris Agreement, which is really to limit the heating of our climate to 1.5, if we can, centigrade. Now, that means that we are, wherever we can, also working intensely with Japan on this issue. Let me give an example. COP25. It is actually currently ongoing in Madrid. Spain now hosting after Chile had said that they weren't able to. So in COP25 we work very closely with Japan because we jointly push for completing the rule book needed for full implementation of the Paris Agreement. And I recently met also the Minister for the Environment, Mr. Koizumi, and we also were completely agreed that a strong unified push by Japan and the EU in COP25 will be needed and necessary to finalize the rule book. So strong cooperation in that regard, upholding the Paris Agreement, and that also was in the Osaka Summit Declaration. Now, if we look at national policies, we are now entering 2020. 2020 is the year of entry into force of the Paris Agreement. And it's also the year when all of us are called upon to review and revisit our national commitments under the Paris Agreement. And that is, of course, an expectation that we as EU have towards ourselves, but also towards all our major partners, because it will depend especially on the major economies of this world that, by the way, also of course includes the US and some others. It will depend on all of us if we can actually engage on ambitious goals for the future. So there is a large expectation, and that of course is also true especially for a country like Japan. We have intensive dialogues on climate, on environment, on oceans, and with Japan, which allows us to exchange experience, the verified experience also from our member states regarding how we try to find the right energy mix, how we deal with the transition period, what mechanisms we can actually have to support this transition. And in that regard, let me mention one, because I think it's a very good example. In Europe, more than 10 years ago, we created an emissions trading scheme. What does it mean? It means that actually, if you are in an industry with a high, emission rate, that you get certain emission permissions or rights, and if you would want to surpass them, then you need to actually buy. So if you emit less, then you have the privilege of being able to trade your surplus to others. It's a business model of making it profitable for companies to reduce their emissions. And so therefore, this mechanism has really worked well, because if I actually look at some of the results, then we could see that we could combine bringing down emissions with ensuring economic growth. So therefore, because very often I hear the argument there's a contradiction between the two. My answer to that, no. This is not our experience, and let me share a figure on this. From 1990 to 2018, the EU's total greenhouse gas emissions decreased by 23% through a large number of measures. But the economy grew at the same time, actually quite substantially. It says here 61%. I wonder, but it's this is what I see here in my notes. But in any case, it's true. You can also use other, periods of this time. So our experience is, you can be successful in business. You can also be innovative in business in terms of renewable energy if you actually find the right measures to reduce your emissions.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Mitsuya Goto, a life member of this club, and ex-Nissan executive who negotiated with Mrs. Thatcher for a long time and finally put Nissan plant in Sunderland, UK. The site was closed, Newcastle Airport, and signed a contract with a contractor, and they built it in one year. It would take 3 years. But anyway, my major concern is what will happen to the Brexit and how Boris Johnson will handle Brexit. Can you give me some ideas? Maybe it's a very difficult question to answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Of course, I can speak for the European Union. I can't speak for the UK. So I speak from an EU perspective, and let me say that for the European Union, it's fair to say that also for me personally, many of us regret that the UK opted to leave the European Union. However, we accept that this was a democratic and a sovereign choice by the British people. And of course, that means that we respect this decision. And ever since, the efforts of the European Union have been aimed at ensuring that this exit happens in an orderly fashion, that we can safeguard the rights of citizens. Also, that we can find a good transition mode for businesses, that we can ensure that there is certainty about how the future will develop. And lastly, also very important, that, of course, for the European Union, we protect the single market and our own cohesion and unity in the process, which also includes that we ensure peace and stability on the island of Ireland, which means between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. So this is where we've been coming from. And so therefore, currently, with the Brexit date now postponed to 31st of January, of course, the goal of this extension was to finally get the withdrawal agreement ratified, because this withdrawal agreement would ensure that at least we have now then an orderly way of Brexit. On top of that, the EU ambition and objective has always been that we should also then construct a very strong future relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union. Because UK might leave the EU, but they don't leave Europe. They are our neighbors. There are many connections, families, mixed marriages, companies, universities, you name it. So therefore, it's not, none of that will really change. And so therefore, for all of us, I think it would be best if we can then find a good future relationship, both in terms of the economic sphere, but also in terms of people-to-people contact, in terms of the science and technology, in terms of movement, and so everything. But of course, that always depends on the two. And so therefore, we always then, of course, need to see what the UK actually thinks about this particular relationship. And that is, of course, something which they need to decide in London. Last comment, I am quite aware that Brexit has weighed heavily on the minds of Japanese business people and Japanese companies, because the UK has been a traditional point of entry for Japan in terms of also the EU market as a whole. So therefore, I should say that, again, it's an area where the EU and Japan have been like-minded. Prime Minister Abe has also called for an orderly Brexit, has also called for getting some insurance and certainty about how then the future economic and business relationship will develop. So therefore, we have again the same interests, and of course I understand that this is a very important topic for the Japanese economy as a whole.
Thank you very much. Yes, gentleman over there.
Hello, my name is Marco from the Japan Times, and I'd like to ask a question also on the topic of Brexit. Specifically about Brexit's effects on Japanese companies. So, as you said, the UK has been a point of entry for many Japanese companies, and it's just, especially after last month's supposedly to happen Brexit, but it didn't, and it created a lot of panic amongst Japanese companies in the UK. Especially, and now there's still a possibility of a hard Brexit, which could definitely be would definitely have a substantial effect. So I would like to ask if, aside from the EPA, what are some actions taken from the EU side to mitigate the panic amongst Japanese companies? Do you think the EPA is enough to show that the EU is ready to accommodate Japanese businesses, probably to other parts of the EU? Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, let me say that, of course, the EPA ensures that Japanese businesses will have very good access to the EU 27. So this is quite clear, and the EPA has brought down tariffs by 95% of all tariffs went down to zero with entry into force of the agreement immediately. And over the period of 15 years, which is included in the EPA, the tariffs on 99% of all of the trade between the EU and Japan will go to zero. So the EU will have very good opportunities, but even beyond that, and I've already talked about that, the EPA also concerns investment options, access to procurement, both ways, for EU companies here in Japan, but vice versa for Japanese, of course, then in the EU. It also should enhance our cooperation in third markets. So I think that there are quite a lot of business chances and opportunities which come with the EPA and which we have not yet reaped, but which really depend on increased also business engagement in the future. So therefore, EU 27 should be a backbone of this cooperation. Of course, this does not solve the problem that a company like Nissan or others might have if they actually have based themselves in the UK with a production facility. But these are business decisions, and it's for every company to then decide how they would best want to go about this issue. Now, what the EU has done is, knowing that we cannot exclude the hard Brexit scenario. And that is why the EU has actually worked now for 2 years on, regulations, a legal basis for making sure that we can at least then limit the damage as far as possible. That means that we have adopted, and that it has been the work of 2 years, we have adopted quite a number of regulations which ensure that, for instance, there is an additional transition period for citizens or people who find themselves in the UK as EU citizens, or the other way around. That there are interim periods for shipments which are on the way. That you can still do payment execution. So the EU has done what we can in order to then soften the impact of a hard Brexit. It will still be painful, but I think that this is all available online. Of course, all of these interim measures are essential also for businesses in the EU and in the UK and everywhere else in the world. And so I think that everybody also here in Japan would be well advised to also get acquainted with these procedures and know what to do if indeed this scenario comes. So we are well prepared, but that doesn't mean that we would welcome any hard Brexit. On the contrary, we don't want a hard Brexit scenario.
Thank you. Julian, go ahead.
Madam Ambassador, Julian Ryle from the British Chamber of Commerce magazine. Again, I'm sorry, it's another Brexit story. You're going to get a few of these tonight, aren't you? Will, in your opinion, given what you've just said, do you think Britain will do better or worse in its trade relationship with Japan after Brexit, assuming that it does go ahead next month after all, and why? And following on from that, in the Japan context, if Britain is going to do worse in its trade relationship with Japan, would you recommend that the UK rethink its Brexit vote?
Well, thank you for this challenging question. First of all, let me say that of course it's not my place to give recommendations to the British people, first of all. Although I might have my private thoughts about that. So the other question is, what would the trade relationship be like between the EU and Japan? I mean, in fact, of course, with the entry into force of the EPA, the EPA currently, of course, applies to the UK and will continue to apply as long as the UK is a member state. The withdrawal agreement, which means that for some time also in future the same procedures would still apply, would also ensure that there is first, there is a sort of continuity under the withdrawal agreement. Everything beyond that depends on the outcome of a negotiation between first the EU and the UK about future relationships, meaning the question of would the UK then still be part of the single market, or would it be customs union, whatever it is. So this is point one. But then secondly, of course, it totally depends on what kind of trade agreement the UK might then want to negotiate with Japan, and how Japan would then do these kind of negotiations. So therefore, as you can see, there's a lot of variables in this, and therefore it's not possible to now predict how this will turn out. The only thing that I would say immediately is that, again, if we have the hard Brexit scenario, that would of course mean that on the first day, once the UK has left the EU, the economic partnership agreement with all of its benefits would immediately cease to apply to the UK. Which is why I think it's not a very attractive scenario in this sense.
Yes, gentleman in the white, please.
Ambassador, my name is Thomas Sullivan. I'm a guest here today. I wanted to ask you about the security, the focus on the security issues. And you mentioned specifically about North Korea and Iran. It doesn't look like North Korea has any appetite to denuclearize. So I just wanted to ask you specifically, what the EU position might be on that. And with regard to Iran, we know that Mrs. Mogherini played a very important role in bringing the JCPOA together, but obviously the United States have now exited, and the situation with Iran as well looks very dangerous now. So again, I just wanted to ask, and President Rouhani appears to have indicated that he would like to make a visit to Japan to meet Prime Minister Abe. So again, I'd just like to ask your position on that. And finally, on China, I'd like to know what the EU position on Chinese investments into the European Union. We know that they're negotiating maybe investments into the 17+1 agreement, and they've bought some assets in Greece and Portugal. Mm-hmm. Again, I'd just like to hear your position on that. And do you think Vice President Borrell will be visiting Japan in the near future to discuss any of these issues? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for these questions. Let me start on the security-related issues. I mean, on DPRK, the EU position has been very clear. I mean, we fully support the non-proliferation treaty, and therefore, from our point of view, of course, it's very clear that North Korea needs to denuclearize, needs to respect all of the United Nations Security Council resolutions. That applies also to the launching of any ballistic, missiles. So this is the demand. Of course, it's clear that would require intensive negotiations, but that must be the objective. Secondly, and there again we agree with Japan, the unwillingness so far by North Korea to really engage in that process has meant that there is a very strong sanctions regime. And the EU, together with Japan, wishes to see that this sanctions regime is fully respected by everyone. Because that is necessary as long as we don't see any progress in the other regard. On Iran, now the EU has been instrumental, together of course with our partners, the 3 EU member states involved, and the others who are part of the agreement, and so therefore. To uphold this nuclear agreement is really very important to us, because it actually assists in keeping peace and stability in the Middle East from our point of view. It addresses one of the major threats there. Now, where are we now? The EU upholds the agreement, but we also ask Iran to uphold the agreement. And this is, of course, also a very relevant issue right now, where we have seen that the US leaving the agreement now really threatens, together with Iran, a recent announcement to undermine the agreement. So therefore, the EU objective remains to get Iran, fully compliant with the agreement. And in that regard, we know we share this goal with Japan, and of course, all efforts geared towards the same objective of keeping the agreement intact are welcome in this sense. China and the investment in the EU. First of all, let me say that, of course, the key for the EU always regarding all investments or all economic engagement is that is always in line with our rules and standards. And so, therefore, of course, Chinese companies can participate in tenders. I would say that it's part of a level playing field to say that such tenders should be open for everybody who satisfies the conditions which are in this tender. So that's point one. Point two, if we look at the security-related questions, the EU is currently engaged in an exercise how to define investment screening. So that this exercise is about defining a joint and common framework among EU member states and in all of the EU. What are the criteria for ensuring that any investment actually corresponds to your own security needs? Because we all know that some questions can arise in terms of security of essential infrastructure. But it's an ongoing exercise, and currently we are in the middle of this exercise, which is carried by member states. And at the end of the day, I'm confident that we will arrive at a joint set of criteria for screening foreign investments from wherever they might come. So obviously this is not then specifically and only China related, but it would be a general tool how we can ensure that we can welcome and accept investments, but then we can also ensure that they are secure and safe in terms of our own needs.
That's we have. Do you have time for one more question?
I think so.
Yeah. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you for your talk. I'm Shihori Komatsu, freelance caster. I was very intrigued in the field of digital security. When you talk about the free flow of data between the EU and Japan, can you elaborate more on the idea and how to protect the privacy in intellectual property? And could you elaborate more on that idea, please? Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. I certainly can. What I have said before, namely that there was both in Tokyo, in Japan, and in the EU, a decision was made about mutual adequacy of the data protection mechanisms. What does it mean? It means basically that the EU side has looked at what are Japanese regulations about privacy of data, protection of personal data, protection of intellectual property rights, business secrets, and so forth. And the conclusion was that the Japanese standards are at the same level that we would require in Europe. So therefore, that if as a European company I exchange data with a Japanese business company, I do not infringe on any of the relevant privacy requirements which we would have. This, of course, is very relevant because it means that now this free flow of data is ensured. Let me also say that the EU in the digital field has adopted recently, like 2 years ago, the General Data Protection Regulation, Gdpr. and which makes very clear. Which has very clear requirements in terms of if you store data, if you request data, if you have data for an event, what can you do with the data, and how do you need to request actually the consent of the people who are actually the owners of these data if you actually do want to process them further. And from our point of view, we think that this GDPR is something like the gold standard, or could be something like the gold standard in the digital age. So therefore, we think it's very good then to work with Japan in order to see how far we can actually then introduce such criteria and such requirements and such protection mechanisms also in the international debate. And let me give you an example where this is relevant. Like in the WTO, we have currently a discussion about e-commerce. So, where of course currently there aren't really clear rules. So it's important that we actually agree on them. We also have a strong debate, of course, with other partners about these issues. The idea would be, of course, that in this globalized, digital economy, that as far as possible we can agree on, common protection standards and combine free flow of data with protection.
Yeah, I think you've asked it now. So if you want to answer it, yeah, sure, go ahead.
No, just to say that as always in life, not everybody agrees on the same ways how you then can achieve protection of these data, and therefore when I say coming from an EU point of view that I think GDPR is wonderful and should be the gold standard, unfortunately the experience is that not immediately everybody else on this world agrees. So it's always part of a negotiation. Of course, this is not an easy negotiation, because there are very many different points of view about these issues between China, the US, the Europeans, and also, of course, many other countries. And that's why we need this multilateral discussion. It takes time. It's sometimes very strenuous, but I think it has the right objective, which is at the end of the day to find an agreement as to how we deal with data in the digital age.
Yeah, thank you very much for your expert view on the new EU Commission and its goals, but also EU-Japan relations. So I think we learned a great deal today. So thank you for coming to the club. Just before you applaud, I think you've agreed to exchange Meishi.
Of course.
Yeah, that's okay.
Well, I'm always ready to exchange Meishi.
That's great news. So if you want to exchange Meishi, please come forward, and Ms. Flor will stay here for a few more minutes. Thank you for coming to today's press conference, and yeah.
Thank you for your interest.